Think you know everything about Arnold Schwarzenegger's mind-bending Mars adventure? From a 50-pound malfunctioning robot head to a director who kept an ambulance on standby due to mass food poisoning, the making of this sci-fi classic was stranger than any implanted memory. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Total Recall 1990. Fact 1. The original score was so complex it broke an orchestra. When Jerry Goldsmith sat down to compose the music for Total Recall in 1990, he created something so technically demanding that it literally overwhelmed an entire professional orchestra. The legendary composer, who had already scored classics like Alien and the Star Trek films, crafted what many consider to be one of his most intricate and challenging pieces of work, blending massive orchestral arrangements with futuristic electronic elements to match Paul Verhoeven's mind-bending vision. The producers initially planned to record Goldsmith's score in Munich, Germany, where musician wages were significantly lower than other major recording centers. This seemed like a smart financial decision for a film that was already pushing budget boundaries as one of the most expensive movies ever made at the time. However, when the Munich Orchestra received Goldsmith's compositions, they quickly discovered they were in over their heads. The German musicians simply couldn't cope with Goldsmith's fiendishly complex writing style, which required precise timing and coordination between traditional brass and string sections combined with sophisticated electronic sounds. The resulting recording sessions were a disaster, producing what Goldsmith himself described as a disappointing score that fell far short of his musical intentions for the film. Rather than compromise his vision, Goldsmith convinced the producers to scrap the Munich recordings entirely and provide additional funding to re-record everything in London with the National Philharmonic Orchestra. These seasoned British musicians were much more familiar with Goldsmith's demanding compositional style and were able to handle the technical challenges that had stumped their German counterparts. The London sessions were put on hiatus for 3 months, while Verhoeven edited the special effects, during which time Goldsmith went off to record his score for Gremlins 2, the new batch, before returning to complete his work on Total Recall. The final London recording became what critics now consider one of Goldsmith's greatest achievements, proving that sometimes the most expensive option is worth every penny. Fact 2. Everyone got food poisoning except 2 people. The 6-month filming of Total Recall in Mexico City turned into a medical nightmare that would make even the most hardened movie crew think twice about international productions. Out of approximately 500 cast and crew members working on the massive science fiction epic, literally everyone except 2 people came down with severe food poisoning during the shoot. The only survivors of this gastrointestinal disaster were Arnold Schwarzenegger and writer Ronald Schusett, though their immunity came from very different approaches to the problem. Schwarzenegger had learned his lesson the hard way during the filming of Predator in Mexico, just 2 years earlier, when he had gotten violently ill from contaminated water. For Total Recall, the action star took no chances and had all of his meals specially catered and flown in from the United States, essentially creating his own personal food safety bubble while everyone around him suffered. Director Paul Verhoeven was hit so hard by the illness that he became genuinely concerned for his health and safety. The situation became so dire that Verhoeven made the unusual decision to keep an ambulance stationed on set at all times, ready to rush anyone to the hospital if their condition worsened. Both Verhoeven and producer Elliot Schick actually had to be airlifted to medical facilities via helicopter during the production. The mass food poisoning wasn't just an inconvenience, but a serious production challenge that could have derailed the entire film. Mexico City in 1989 was already dealing with severe pollution and air quality issues that were affecting the cast and crew's health, and the added burden of widespread illness from contaminated food created a perfect storm of medical problems. Despite these challenging conditions, the production pressed forward with sick crew members continuing to work on the elaborate sets and complex special effects that would make Total Recall a groundbreaking achievement in practical filmmaking. Fact 3. Arnold's fat lady disguise weighed 50 pounds. One of Total Recall's most memorable scenes features Arnold Schwarzenegger disguised as a heavy-set woman at a Mars Customs checkpoint, repeatedly saying 2 weeks before the robotic mask malfunctions spectacularly. What audiences didn't realize is that this seemingly simple disguise effect became an engineering nightmare that transformed from a lightweight costume into a 50-pound mechanical monster. Special effects designer Rob Bottin initially conceived the fat lady disguise as a fully mechanical creation rather than using traditional makeup techniques, believing audiences needed to see something completely original. The challenge was finding an actress large enough to believably contain Schwarzenegger's massive frame, which led the team to consider wrestlers and bodybuilders before finally casting Priscilla Allen, who played the character in the opening scenes where she appears to malfunction by contorting her face and slurring her speech. The original plan called for a lightweight mask that would split open to reveal Schwarzenegger inside, but the construction process quickly spiraled out of control. When the initial plastic version began warping after just a few days, the team rebuilt it using fiberglass, but that version warped as well. The final attempt involved reinforcing the entire structure with steel coated in laminated resin before cutting the head into sections, but even this heavy-duty approach continued to warp slightly after several days of use. What started as a simple costume had become a 20-pound piece of metal and resin, but the problems weren't over yet. Since a live performer could no longer wear such a heavy contraption, Bottin decided to build a complete mechanical Schwarzenegger to go inside it. The mechanisms that controlled the head opening effect had to be concealed on the back of the fat lady's head, pushing the total weight to almost 50 pounds. The final result required hydraulic systems and multiple operators to control the head lifting above the body to reveal Schwarzenegger within, creating one of the film's most technically complex practical effects. Fact 4. Kuato required 15 puppeteers to operate. The grotesque mutant leader Kuato, who grows out of his twin brother George's stomach, stands as one of the most complex practical effects ever created for a movie, requiring an army of 15 different puppeteers working in perfect coordination to bring the character to life. This wasn't a case of simply strapping an animatronic creature to actor Marshall Bell's body, but rather an incredibly sophisticated engineering feat that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1990 special effects technology. Special effects master Rob Bottin made the radical decision to build both Kuato and Marshall Bell as complete puppets rather than having Bell wear any part of the contraption. This meant that the puppeteers weren't just controlling Kuato's movements, but also operating Marshall Bell's head and facial expressions, creating what was essentially a two-character puppet system operated by the same team. The life-size Marshall Bell duplicate was constructed with Kuato built directly into the torso area, allowing for seamless integration between the twin characters. Each aspect of Kuato's performance required specialized control systems operated by different technicians. His eyebrows were computer-controlled for precise expressions, while his eyes were operated using wireless remote controls for realistic eye movement. A sophisticated set of bellows simulated breathing for both characters independently, creating the illusion that they were separate living beings sharing the same body. Kuato's mouth movements were controlled by servo motors linked to a computer system that shaped his lips for each vowel and consonant, though the limited technology meant that individual pieces of dialogue couldn't be spliced together and had to be recorded and performed simultaneously. The name Kuato itself comes from the Spanish word cuate, which means twin, perfectly reflecting the character's nature as a conjoined being. The puppet was so realistic that strangers would approach director Paul Verhoeven on the street asking if Marshall Bell was actually some kind of deformed Siamese twin, testament to the incredible craftsmanship that went into creating this unforgettable character. Fact 5. The three-breasted woman was almost four-breasted. The iconic three-breasted mutant prostitute that Arnold Schwarzenegger encounters on Mars was originally supposed to have even more breasts, but director Paul Verhoeven's ambitious vision ran into an unexpected problem when test audiences delivered some brutally honest feedback. Verhoeven initially wanted the character, played by actress Laisha Neff, to sport four breasts instead of the three that made it into the final film, believing that more would be better when it came to creating a memorable mutant design. Special effects designer Rob Bottin worked closely with Verhoeven to create the prosthetic appliance that would transform Neff into this otherworldly character. The process of designing the breasts took several attempts to get right, as Bottin needed to find a slender actress who could accommodate the prosthetics while making them look like real flesh affected by gravity. The final appliance extended from Neff's neck all the way down to her waist, and required two makeup artists up to 8 hours to fully apply each day she worked on the film. However, when early versions of the four-breasted design were shown to test audiences, the feedback was overwhelmingly negative and surprisingly specific. Audience members said the character looked too bovine, like a cow ready to be milked, which was definitely not the sexy, exotic effect that Verhoeven was hoping to achieve. The comparison to dairy cattle was so persistent and unflattering that it became clear the design wasn't working as intended. Arnold Schwarzenegger himself had actually suggested the four-breast concept, even going so far as to propose that they be arranged with larger ones positioned over smaller ones, based on medical pictures he had seen. But Rob Bottin felt this approach was too realistic and wouldn't fit the film's overall aesthetic style. The team ultimately settled on the three-breast design, which struck the right balance between being unusual and mutant-like while still maintaining the character's intended appeal, creating one of cinema's most memorable and frequently referenced sci-fi characters. Fact 6. It used early motion capture technology. Total Recall became one of the first major Hollywood films to experiment with motion capture technology, using this cutting-edge technique to create the memorable X-ray scanner sequences where characters appear as walking skeletons. Arnold Schwarzenegger had to wear a special bodysuit covered with 18 reflective bulbs while performing his movements, which were then captured and translated into the digital skeletal animations that audiences see on screen. The motion capture approach was originally chosen as a backup plan when the visual effects team at DreamQuest Images and Metrolight Studios realized they needed a more sophisticated method than traditional stop-motion animation to create realistic human movement. At the time, motion capture was primarily being used to analyze golf swings in the sports industry, where companies could charge premium prices to help golfers improve their technique by studying their movements frame by frame. The technology seemed like the perfect solution for the X-ray scanner scene, which required precise human movements that would look convincing when converted to skeletal form. However, the early computer graphics software proved to be far more temperamental than anyone expected, and the system broke down during production. When the digital technology failed to deliver the results the filmmakers needed, the visual effects team had to quickly pivot to hand-drawn animation techniques to complete the sequence. Despite the technical difficulties, the motion capture footage wasn't entirely wasted. The team used the recorded movements as reference material for the hand-animated sequences, helping them achieve more realistic motion than would have been possible without the captured data. The reflective bulb suit that Schwarzenegger wore provided valuable reference points that animators could use to ensure the skeleton's movements matched the actor's natural gait and gestures. This early experiment with motion capture technology placed Total Recall at the forefront of a revolution that would eventually transform the entire film industry. even though the actual implementation had to rely on traditional animation methods when the computers couldn't handle the complex task of processing human movement data. Fact 7. Patrick Swayze was the original lead. Before Arnold Schwarzenegger ever stepped foot on Mars, Patrick Swayze was signed to play Douglas Quaid in what would have been a completely different version of Total Recall. The Dirty Dancing star was cast when director Bruce Beresford was attached to helm the project, and the film was already well into pre-production, with sets being constructed in Australia when disaster struck the production. Producer Dino De Laurentiis had originally envisioned Total Recall as a more Spielbergian adventure, less gritty and violent than the Paul Verhoeven version that eventually made it to theaters. This version would have starred Swayze in what the filmmakers described as a more accessible, mainstream approach to Philip K. Dick's mind-bending story. The casting made sense at the time, as Swayze was riding high on the success of Dirty Dancing and Ghost, making him one of Hollywood's most bankable leading men. The production was moving forward with considerable momentum, with Australian crews building elaborate Mars sets and preparing for what was expected to be a major international production. However, just as filming was about to begin, De Laurentiis Entertainment Group suddenly filed for bankruptcy, bringing the entire project to a screeching halt. The bankruptcy was so unexpected and complete that crews were immediately fired, and the expensive sets that had been constructed specifically for the film were destroyed rather than stored. When Arnold Schwarzenegger learned about the project's collapse, he saw an opportunity to finally get involved in a film he had long wanted to make. Schwarzenegger had been interested in Total Recall for years, but had been told by De Laurentiis that he wasn't right for the role. With the bankruptcy clearing the way for new ownership, Schwarzenegger convinced Carolco Pictures to purchase the rights for $3 million, specifically so he could star in the film. This intervention completely transformed Total Recall from Swayze's potential sci-fi drama into Schwarzenegger's action-packed blockbuster spectacle. Fact 8. The dog skeleton came from La Brea tar pits. When the visual effects team needed to create a realistic dog skeleton for the X-ray scanner sequence in Total Recall, they didn't rely on computer graphics or artificial models, but instead borrowed an actual ancient skeleton from one of Los Angeles' most famous paleontological sites. The team at Metrolight Studios obtained a genuine timber wolf skeleton from the Page Museum at the La Brea tar pits, giving the digital dog in the film an authentic skeletal structure that would have been nearly impossible to recreate artificially. The La Brea tar pits, located in the heart of Los Angeles, contain one of the world's most significant collections of Ice Age fossils, with over 3.5 million specimens recovered from the ancient asphalt deposits. The Page Museum houses thousands of these prehistoric remains, including numerous complete wolf skeletons that have been preserved in remarkable detail for tens of thousands of years. For the Total Recall effects team, this represented a perfect opportunity to use genuine biological reference material rather than guessing what a canine skeleton should look like. The decision to use a real wolf skeleton rather than a domestic dog skeleton was both practical and scientifically sound, since wolves and dogs share nearly identical bone structures due to their close evolutionary relationship. The timber wolf specimen provided the exact proportions and anatomical details needed to create a convincing X-ray effect that would hold up to close scrutiny on the big screen. This attention to scientific accuracy extended throughout the X-ray sequence, as the effects team also digitized a complete database of human skeletons to ensure that all the skeletal imagery in the film looked authentic. The Metrolight team had to carefully study the borrowed wolf skeleton and convert its three-dimensional structure into digital data that could be animated to match the movements of the live dog used in the filming of the scene, creating a seamless blend of practical animal performance with digitally enhanced skeletal visualization. that audiences would find both believable and scientifically plausible. Fact 9. David Cronenberg wrote 12 script drafts. Before Paul Verhoeven ever became involved with Total Recall, the legendary body horror director David Cronenberg spent an entire year crafting 12 different script drafts that would have created a vastly different and much stranger version of the film. Cronenberg, famous for movies like The Fly and Videodrome, was hired by producer Dino De Laurentiis in 1984 to adapt Philip K. Dick's short story into something much closer to the author's original vision than what eventually made it to theaters. Working on a Xerox 860 word processor, Cronenberg constantly rewrote and refined his approach to the story, meeting regularly with producer Arnold Schwarzenegger, but frequently clashing over the direction the project should take. Cronenberg's version delved deeper into the psychological and philosophical themes that made Dick's writing so distinctive, focusing more on questions of identity and reality rather than the action-adventure elements that would later define Schwarzenegger's version. Among the most bizarre elements in Cronenberg's drafts were creatures called Ganzibulls, which were originally created by Schwarzenegger but elaborated upon by Cronenberg in typical body horror fashion. These mutant space camels lived in the sewers beneath Venusville, the underground Martian city, having been brought to Mars as pack animals wearing oxygen masks before radiation transformed them into grotesque sewer-dwelling monsters. Production illustrator Ron Miller recalled that in Cronenberg's version, these creatures were specifically mutant camels that had adapted to the harsh Martian environment in disturbing ways. The creative differences between Cronenberg and the producers eventually reached a breaking point during a meeting where Schwarzenegger told Cronenberg, "You know what you've done? You've done the Philip K. Dick version," as if that were somehow a terrible thing. Schwarzenegger wanted something more like Raiders of the Lost Ark Goes to Mars, while Cronenberg preferred to explore the deeper psychological implications of memory, identity, and reality that made Dick's work so compelling to literary science fiction fans. Fact 10. Arnold cut his hand on exploding glass. Arnold Schwarzenegger ended up requiring genuine medical stitches during the filming of Total Recall when a carefully planned safety stunt went dangerously wrong, turning what should have been a routine special effects sequence into a real injury that could have seriously harmed the star. The incident occurred during the intense subway chase scene where Schwarzenegger's character, Douglas Quaid, crashes through the X-ray scanner's glass barrier while being pursued by his enemies. The scene called for Schwarzenegger to smash through a large glass panel as part of his dramatic escape from the skeletal security scanner, and the stunt coordinators had set up what they believed was a foolproof safety system. The glass was supposed to be pre-exploded, using small detonators that would shatter it into harmless pieces just moments before Schwarzenegger made contact, allowing him to burst through what would appear to be solid glass without any risk of injury. However, the carefully timed explosive charges failed to detonate on cue, leaving Schwarzenegger to punch his hand directly through a solid piece of real glass instead of the pre-shattered safety glass that was supposed to be there. The timing mishap meant that instead of breaking through harmless fragments, the action star's hand went straight into genuine glass that cut him badly enough to require medical attention and stitches to close the wound. Despite the injury, Schwarzenegger's professionalism and commitment to the film meant that production continued without major delays. The incident serves as a reminder of how dangerous even the most carefully planned movie stunts can become when safety equipment fails to work as intended. This wasn't the only injury Schwarzenegger sustained during the physically demanding production, but it was certainly one of the most preventable, caused entirely by a technical malfunction rather than any miscalculation about the stunt itself. The final scene in the movie shows the successful take, though viewers have no way of knowing about the real blood that was shed to capture that dramatic moment. Fact 11. Minority Report was originally Total Recall 2. Steven Spielberg's 2002 sci-fi thriller Minority Report with Tom Cruise actually began its life as a direct sequel to Total Recall, with Arnold Schwarzenegger set to return as Douglas Quaid in a story that would have combined the psychic elements of both Philip K. Dick stories into one continuing narrative. The sequel was planned to take place after the events of the first film, with Mars now established as an independent planet, and Quaid working as a reformed law enforcement officer for an elite crime prevention unit. Total Recall co-writer Gary Goldman had optioned Dick's short story The Minority Report in 1992 with the intention of creating his directorial debut as a low-budget feature film. However, when he showed the story to Total Recall director Paul Verhoeven, the filmmaker immediately recognized its potential as a sequel and suggested adapting it as Total Recall 2, The Minority Report. The concept would have featured Martian mutants using their psychic abilities to predict crimes before they happened, with Quaid forced to go on the run when the precogs predict he will commit murder within 48 hours. By 1994, the sequel was moving forward with Schwarzenegger, Verhoeven, Goldman, and original co-writer Ronald Schwarzenegger all committed to the project. Schwarzenegger was particularly eager to work with Verhoeven again after their successful collaboration, and the star was actively involved in developing the story. However, Carolco Pictures, the studio behind the original film, fell into bankruptcy after a series of expensive failures, most notably the pirate adventure Cutthroat Island, which lost so much money that it contributed to the studio's collapse. When Carolco went under, the rights to The Minority Report reverted back to Goldman and Schwarzenegger, who removed all the Total Recall elements from their script and developed it as a standalone project. The story eventually made its way to Miramax and then to 21st Century Fox, where it caught the attention of Steven Spielberg and Tom Cruise, who had been looking for the right project to collaborate on for years. Fact 12. The film went through 40 script drafts. Total Recall holds the dubious honor of being one of Hollywood's most notorious development hell projects, requiring 40 different script drafts, 7 different directors, and multiple casting changes over a grueling 16-year journey from initial concept to final release. This epic struggle to bring Philip K. Dick's story to the screen began in 1974, when producer Ronald Schwarzenegger purchased the rights to the short story We Can Remember It For You wholesale for just $1,000, having no idea he was embarking on one of the longest and most complicated productions in film history. The project's endless rewrites reflected the fundamental challenge of adapting Dick's complex, philosophical story into a mainstream Hollywood blockbuster. Various versions of the script depicted the main character Douglas Quaid as everything from a mild-mannered accountant to Arnold Schwarzenegger's suggestion of a construction worker, with each new director and writer bringing their own interpretation to the material. The 7 directors who were attached to the project at different points included Richard Rush, Bruce Beresford, Russell Mulcahy, and David Cronenberg, each bringing vastly different visions that required extensive script revisions. The constant script changes also reflected the studio's uncertainty about how to market such an unusual story. Some versions leaned heavily into the action elements, while others focused on the psychological thriller aspects of the memory implantation concept. Dan O'Bannon, who co-wrote the original screenplay with Schwarzenegger, eventually had a falling out with Paul Verhoeven over the extensive changes made to their original vision, illustrating how the lengthy development process created conflicts between the various creative parties involved. By the time Paul Verhoeven finally came aboard as director, the script had been through so many iterations that writer Gary Goldman was brought in to help create what would become the final shooting script. Even then, the rewrites continued throughout production, with some scenes being modified right up until filming began. making Total Recall a testament to both Hollywood persistence and the creative challenges of adapting literary science fiction for mass audiences. Fact 13. Ronny Cox's hair accidentally created his character look. The menacing appearance of villain Velos Cohagen, with his distinctive slicked-back hairstyle that perfectly captured his ruthless corporate dictator persona, came about entirely by accident during a routine special effects procedure that had nothing to do with costume design or character development. Actor Ronny Cox was simply having his face molded for various special effects purposes when the technician slicked his hair back to keep it out of the way during the messy plaster casting process. When Cox saw his reflection with the slicked back hair, he immediately recognized that this accidental styling was absolutely perfect for his character. The severe corporate look created by the slicked back hair gave Cohagen a cold, calculating appearance that matched the character's role as the tyrannical governor of Mars who controls the planet's air supply for profit. Cox knew instantly that this was exactly how his villain should look throughout the entire film. The problem was that Cox had already filmed 2 full days of scenes with his normal hairstyle, creating a continuity nightmare that would require expensive reshooting. However, Cox was so convinced that the slicked back look was right for the character that he approached director Paul Verhoeven and convinced him to redo those previously completed scenes with the new hairstyle. Verhoeven agreed that the accidental discovery significantly improved the character's visual impact and decided the reshoot was worth the additional cost and schedule complications. The decision to reshoot those 2 days of footage proved to be one of those happy accidents that often occur during filmmaking, where an unplanned moment leads to a creative breakthrough. Cox's approach to playing Cohagen didn't rely on method acting techniques, but rather on understanding how the character would think and react in different situations. And the slicked back hair became an important visual element that helped him embody the corporate villain's mindset. The hairstyle became so associated with the character that it's difficult to imagine Cohagen looking any other way, proving that sometimes the best creative choices happen completely by chance. Fact 14. Sharon Stone was called the female Terminator. Arnold Schwarzenegger was so genuinely impressed by Sharon Stone's incredible dedication to physical training and her fearless approach to performing her own stunts that he gave her the ultimate compliment from an action star. He nicknamed her the female Terminator. This wasn't just casual flattery between co-stars, but a serious recognition of Stone's commitment to transforming herself into a believable action performer who could hold her own alongside one of Hollywood's most physically demanding leading men. Stone threw herself into an intensive training regimen that prepared her for the physically demanding role of Laurie, Quaid's seemingly loving wife, who is revealed to be a deadly secret agent. The training was so rigorous and her performance so convincing that the professional stunt community took notice of her abilities. Her dedication to the physical aspects of the role was so exceptional that she was inducted as an honorary member of the Stunt Woman Association, a rare honor that recognized her commitment to performing many of her own action sequences. The casting of Stone and Rachel Ticotin as the female leads was deliberately focused on finding actresses with the athletic ability needed for their physically demanding roles. Both women were chosen partly for their natural athleticism, which would be essential for the intense fight scenes and action sequences that Paul Verhoeven had planned. Stone later described how her physically formidable character resulted in the cast and crew treating her like she was one of the guys throughout the production. Stone's co-star Michael Ironside, who played the ruthless villain Richter, was particularly respectful of her efforts and was noted as being the one guy who never forgot I was a woman. When Stone was thrown down during fight scenes, Ironside would always help her back up, showing a gentlemanly consideration that stood out in the rough and tumble environment of the action-heavy production. Stone's performance in Total Recall would later lead directly to her casting in Paul Verhoeven's next film, Basic Instinct, where her ability to portray dangerous, physically capable women would make her a major star. Fact 15. People thought Kuato was real. The special effects team behind Total Recall created such a convincing and lifelike Kuato puppet that strangers would regularly approach director Paul Verhoeven on the streets asking if actor Marshall Bell was actually a deformed Siamese twin in real life. The puppet was so realistic in its appearance and movements that people who saw the film genuinely believed they were watching a real person with an actual physical deformity rather than an elaborate mechanical creation. This confusion wasn't limited to casual moviegoers who might not understand how special effects work, but extended to people who should have known better about the capabilities of movie magic. The puppet's incredibly detailed skin texture, natural breathing movements, and expressive facial features were so convincing that even sophisticated audiences couldn't tell they were looking at an artificial creation controlled by a team of technicians. Special effects designer Rob Bottin had deliberately crafted Kuato to look as realistic as possible, using advanced techniques to make the puppet's skin appear to have natural weight and movement under gravity. The puppet's eyes could move independently, his eyebrows were computer-controlled for precise expressions, and a sophisticated breathing system made both Kuato and his twin brother George appear to breathe naturally as separate living beings sharing the same body. The realistic appearance was enhanced by Marshall Bell's own voice performance as Kuato, which was recorded live during filming rather than added later in post-production. Bell provided both the physical reference for George and the voice of Kuato, creating a seamless performance that made the puppet seem genuinely alive. The combination of cutting-edge mechanical engineering, detailed craftsmanship, and Bell's vocal performance created such a believable character that audiences couldn't separate reality from special effects. This public confusion about Kuato's authenticity became one of the highest compliments the effects team could receive, proving that their months of painstaking work had achieved the ultimate goal of any movie illusion, making the impossible appear completely real to audiences around the world.